This hour on I-24 News, a member of the Israeli parliament has been called a terrorist in a suit after congratulating Palestinian rivals Hamas and Fatah on their reconciliation efforts.
Turkey and Iran's leaders united in their opposition to a Kurdish state, both fearing Kurdish separatism within their own borders.
And Spain's king has been speaking out in a rare address, calling the Catalan government disloyal. It comes of its rising discontent amongst Catalonians who are protesting in the streets.
From the I-24 News studios in Times Square in New York, this is Crossroads with David Schuster and Michelle McCory.
And welcome, everybody. Tal Heinrich is in for Michelle. Good to have you here, as always.
Thank you. Good to be here.
There are efforts by rival Palestinian factions to form a unified government in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and they are causing somewhat of a rift among lawmakers in Israel's Knesset.
It comes after an Arab member of parliament called Palestinian leaders to congratulate them on their reconciliation efforts. I-24 News diplomatic correspondent Mike Wagenheim has the story.
A terrorist in a suit. That pretty much sums up the coalition government's feelings toward Joint Arab List Chairman Ayman Odeh. This comes after Odeh phoned Hamas and Fatah leaders on Tuesday to congratulate them on their Palestinian reconciliation efforts. Firebrand Likud parliament member Oren Hazan slapped Odeh with the terrorist label and said he would file a complaint against Odeh for illegal contact with Hamas, a terrorist organization. Hazan said both coalition and opposition members were tired of seeing the joint list work directly against Israel's well-being from inside the Knesset, Israel's parliament, and that Hazan would undertake an effort to have Odeh removed from office. Deputy Minister for Public Diplomacy Michael Oren's comments were much softer. He called for a police investigation into the call, claiming it likely violated Israeli law. There's been a long-running conflict between the government's right-wing factions and the Arab parties, who are often accused of putting Palestinian Arab interests ahead of those of Israel, and in some instances, directly or indirectly, calling for an end to the Jewish state. Joint List member Basil Gattas was sentenced this summer to 2 years in prison for smuggling cell phones to Palestinian Arab security prisoners. Fellow Joint Lister Hanin Zoabi has been labeled a traitor for her seeming justification for Palestinian Arab terrorist activities and other violence. Israeli Defense Minister Avigdor Lieberman piled on, saying the Joint List has become a fifth column and acts as a senior representative of terrorist organizations in the government. He said Israeli Arabs are largely loyal to the state, and they should pick new political leaders who represent that stance. For his part, Odeh tweeted that those opposed to reconciliation oppose peace. The Joint List has long claimed that the Israeli government has lost interest in a two-state solution, and it is up to them to fight for an end to what they call Israel's occupation of the West Bank. The Israeli parliament returns to session after the Jewish high holidays, and if the past is any indication, sparks will fly, and the war of words inside the Knesset is far from over. Mike Wagenheim, I-24 News.
For more, we're joined by Washington correspondent Mike Viqueira, Michael Wilner, Jerusalem Post Washington correspondent, and our senior diplomatic correspondent, Nina Larson. And Mike Viqueira, I want to start with you because while the Likud government in Israel might be uncomfortable with a Palestinian reconciliation, fair to say that this could also cause some awkwardness for the Trump administration, given that the United States still brands Hamas a terrorist organization.
Well, if these talks continue down the road and they actually make some progress, I think that that's quite a possibility. At this point, I think everybody here in Washington, or many people here in Washington, are looking at this with sort of a jaundiced eye. Clearly today, at the State Department, the spokeswoman there said, we hope it will bear fruit. We welcome these efforts. Clearly, Washington taking a wait-and-see approach. This is not the first time there have been efforts at reconciliation between Hamas and Fatah. One thing that the spokeswoman at the State Department did add is that Hamas must commit to nonviolence. Obviously, that's a pretty high bar, given the history there, David.
We just saw in this report a tweet by Arab member of Knesset, Ayman Odeh, saying that whoever is against this reconciliation between Fatah and Hamas is basically against peace. If Israel wants peace, should it want the Palestinians to reconcile between themselves? Is it necessarily an interest of the Israeli government?
And Michael Wilner, why don't you take that one?
Well, the President's Special Representative for International Negotiations, Jason Greenblatt, certainly believes so. He gave a speech during UN Week in which he said that it was in furtherance of peace that the Palestinian Authority reclaim control over the Strip. And it is clearly a priority of his team and the team of Jared Kushner. The question remains why they believe that to be the case. And it seems to be that they believe that there's something to the Israeli argument that there hasn't been a partner on the other side that actually represents all the people of what would be a future Palestine. So the U.S. government absolutely does support reconciliation of some kind so long as Hamas gives up control over security.
Nina Larson, to Mike Vaquera's point about Washington keeping a jaundiced eye on all this, fair to say that the United Nations, the international diplomatic community, may also be a little bit skeptical about this Palestinian reconciliation effort as well.
Well, that's a good point, David. We have seen attempts at this kind of reconciliation over the years, but I think maybe the calculus has changed. I think we might be seeing a much more pragmatic approach from Hamas. If we look back to May, they unveiled their new charter, and in that charter they renounced ties with the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, this was really to appease Egypt, which is a major player behind the scenes. We've got the reconciliation talks, more serious talks, coming up in Cairo in just a couple of weeks. If we look at the geographical plight of Gaza, they're really hemmed in by the Rafah crossing. That's the crossing with Egypt. Now, if they can convince Egypt that there's less of a security threat, then that crossing will be open. It will make the lives of ordinary Gazans much easier. Don't you agree, Michael?
I'm sorry?
Well, let's
I was asking you if you agree that Egypt is... Michael in the studio, I'm throwing this to.
But, David...
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question.
Yeah, Mike can't hear Nina, but to Nina's point, she mentioned that some conditions have changed and matured because we've seen many attempts of reconciliation throughout the years, and I just want to give you a quote of what Hamas Gaza chief Yahya Sinwar said this week. He said he would break the neck of anyone who opposed the reconciliation. So it seems that Hamas is very determined to get this reconciliation.
It does seem like they're determined, and as we heard from J.J. Goldberg earlier in the evening, that Hamas is perhaps taking the initial steps towards being willing to meet some of the demands of Fatah, and some of those demands include letting the Hamas military be directed by Fatah as opposed to fighting Fatah, which was the case just a few years ago. And as we watch all this unfold, you have to wonder, well, is it possible maybe that Hamas, which was just fighting a war against Israel a few years ago, what do you see as being the dramatic sea change that has caused this?
Well, the main question is, will Hamas still remain in military power over the Gaza Strip? That's like the biggest hurdle there, mentioning the war. Think about that. I don't know if Hamas, will surrender the Qassam brigades to Fatah, which is one of the conditions of President Abbas. Mike Wilner, what do you think about it?
Yeah, I think this is ultimately the million-dollar question, and it's the reason why reconciliation has been so difficult to achieve for the past 10 years. And obviously Abu Mazen came out and said that we're not going to tolerate a Hezbollah in Lebanon model. And I think that that's what we're facing here, because Hezbollah, or rather Hamas, is not going to unilaterally go away. The question is, what sort of formation does it foresee for itself if it does sort of relinquish these classic mechanisms of control?
And Mike Vaquera, in the bigger picture, we saw the Trump administration start off with very high hopes about a broader Middle East peace deal. The president made his first trip to Saudi Arabia and then to Israel. Is this a case where perhaps the administration has learned that, the hard way, that this is far more complex and nuanced than perhaps even the greatest deal maker himself could have imagined?
Yeah, surprise, surprise. And David, I think you bring up a good point, and it's important to look at it in a regional context as always, but in particular with this division now among the Arab states, Saudi Arabia and Egypt, as well as the other Gulf states leading this this fight, this embargo, this economic blockade in all effect against Qatar, much of which Qatar, of course, providing its citizens, providing much of the funding for Hamas. So the question is, when does the Trump administration finally intercede in a forceful way in that rift? And there's an argument here in the United States that if, in fact, they allow this to go on, then it actually plays as an inducement to bring Hamas, bring this reconciliation together. And I think the other point to make here in the very meta sort of larger 30,000-foot political perspective in terms of Israel and the United States. Obviously, Israel and the government of Benjamin Netanyahu getting along famously, still very close. Relations seem very outwardly warm between the Trump administration and the Prime Minister of Israel, who just recently called these meetings in Gaza a bogus reconciliation. So there's very little incentive, at least in the short term, in a public way, for the administration to get out ahead of Benjamin Netanyahu in any significant way. David.
Well, Israeli Defense Minister Avigdor Lieberman, he called these Fatah-Hamas talks struggle for public opinion.
Well,
is that possible? Whose public opinion is he referring to?
And it may be Abbas. Maybe Mahmoud Abbas is looking to solidify his position. He's only got like a 20% approval rating among all the Palestinians.
Right.
A lot of them hate him. Maybe if Abbas is able to get some support from Hamas, it strengthens his own domestic position, even if it makes it more difficult for Abbas, therefore, to negotiate some sort of a peace deal with the Israelis. But Nina Larson, I sort of wonder if the position, whether it's the United States or even the Netanyahu government in all of this right now, is to sort of sit back, and yes, there will be some ministers who may criticize the talks, but just to sort of sit back and see where they go.
Yes, well, this has always been the problem in any Middle East peace process over the past several years, that the Palestinians just aren't coordinated. And I think we might be seeing a real look ahead to a change in leadership with the Palestinian Authority. Abbas is in his 80s now. He's not very popular. And a figure that's been waiting in the wings for several years now is Mohammed Dahlan. He was the Fatah security chief in Gaza until 2007, when the two factions split. And he's been waiting in the wings very carefully in the UAE, where he's been waiting in exile. And he's been really getting a lot of leverage from the UAE and from Egypt in putting some funds into Gaza and the plight of the Gazan people. This is someone I think is staging a major comeback politically. And really, the key thing is that people in Gaza really want a better quality of life. And if he can promise them some injection of funds from the United Arab Emirates and freedom to now cross into Egypt and the Rafah crossing, which has been closed for several years now under Sisi, then I think we could see a real sea change. But again, I'm speculating. But I think most Palestinians are really looking to the next generation of leadership now. And Hamas is taking a much more pragmatic look. If they can basically split the military side of things from their political wing, if they can show the world, frankly, and the Trump administration that they are serious about being a trustworthy partner in some kind of peace process, then I think we need to look at the big picture here.
Well, and the big picture, of course, is President Trump of the United States pursuing this sort of role as a mediator. And Michael Wilner, I got to ask you about this report out of Israel from Haaretz that suggested that President Trump told the UN Secretary General that the Israeli Prime Minister has been a bigger problem in terms of trying to restart peace talks than Mahmoud Abbas. What do you make of that report?
I deeply respect Barak Ravid. We haven't been able to independently verify that. But I think that certainly the president has made this a priority. I think that it's taken quite a bit of time for him to understand and get his head around the complexities of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and indeed to realize that, Netanyahu is going to be an obstacle to his sort of vision of how this process is going to proceed. But to be clear, we haven't independently verified that.
Tal, what do you make of this report?
I believe that's very good material for the opposition in the Israeli parliament and people who are very much against Prime Minister Netanyahu in Israel and his policies. So it's feeding their cause there. probably making big headlines in Israel as well.
And certainly, I mean, look, to the extent that they can create some sort of wedge between the Netanyahu government and the Trump administration, that would certainly help the Israeli left, or the left of center of Netanyahu at least. Anyway, fascinating conversation. Our thanks to Washington correspondent Mike Vaquera, Michael Wilner from the Jerusalem Post, and our senior diplomatic correspondent Nina Larson. Thank you as well. Coming up on Crossroads, Turkey's president has taken a trip to Iran.
Presidents Erdogan and Rouhani uniting in their joint opposition to an independent Kurdish state. Details ahead.
Plus, Catalonians are taking to the streets again, protesting police violence towards independence-minded voters.
As Spain's king accuses the Catalan Authority of attempting to break the nation's unity.
Welcome back to Crossroads. This has been another intriguing day in terms of geopolitical machinations in the Middle East. Turkish President Erdogan met with leaders in Iran on this day to discuss their country's united opposition to Iraqi Kurdish independence.
Iran and Turkey both fear Kurdish separatism within their own borders and have threatened to join Baghdad in imposing economic sanctions on Iraqi Kurdistan. During the meeting, Erdogan once again claimed that Israel's intelligence agency had a guiding hand in last week's Kurdish independence referendum.
For more on this, we're joined by Yoav Borowitz from our headquarters in Tel Aviv. And Yoav, Israel has dismissed Erdogan's claims, but tell us, what would the implications be for Israel if a Kurdish state were to come to pass?
Well, David, it is difficult to foresee any direct and immediate implications for Israel, even if Iraqi Kurds are granted independence, although Israel, for now, is the only country supporting the Kurdish independence claim. Israel also doesn't have diplomatic ties with Iraq in any case, and Iraqi leadership is upset. Iraqi leadership is upset with Israel already, even if the Kurds will not be granted independence. However, there are voices, even in Israel, that the leadership here did not have to butt in the Kurdish independence claim. On the other hand, David, many here, and not only here, see Israeli support of Kurdish independence as noble.
And meanwhile, Yoav, Netanyahu in Israel will face questioning once again after the Jewish holidays over his suspected involvement in 2 bribery probes. What can you tell us about that?
While Prime Minister Netanyahu has already been questioned several times by police, this new investigation comes amid revelations that his wife Sarah systematically worked to conceal the cost of pricey private chefs, with taxpayers footing the bill. Sarah Netanyahu was informed a few months back that she will be indicted pending a hearing. Israeli police claim that they want the Prime Minister to respond to the body of evidence in a relaxed setting, quote unquote. We'll just mention again that Netanyahu is being investigated in 2 different corruption probes.
Yoav Borowitz in our Tel Aviv headquarters, thank you. And we're staying in the region. Meantime, Turkey is blaming the deaths of 4 of its soldiers on Kurdish rebels.
That's right. Turkey says that the soldiers were killed by a roadside bomb planted by the rebels.
It happened in southeast Turkey, near the country's border with Iran and Iraq. The region is home to Turkey's Kurdish minority, currently fighting another battle for independence.
And speaking of independence, there is trouble on another front for independence, this one in Spain.
European leaders are facing criticism after declaring that Spain's government used a proportionate amount of force in the aftermath of Sunday's referendum in Catalonia. Senior international affairs correspondent Owen Alterman has more on the atmosphere in Catalonia.
Catalans wanted to send a message, and these pictures sent it. 700,000 protesters in the streets of Barcelona as part of Tuesday's general strike, rallying against police violence during Sunday's referendum and dramatizing their cause. Meanwhile, in the standoff between Barcelona and Madrid, no one is standing down. Spanish King Felipe taken to television Tuesday night for a rare address, with this to say about the Catalan government.
With their decisions, they have systematically broken norms legally approved, showing an inadmissible disloyalty towards the state powers.
Many Catalans were not pleased. In a bar in central Barcelona, this was the feeling.
He has blamed the Catalan government as if the Spanish government had nothing to do with it. It's a pathetic speech to say what he said. He would have been better off saying nothing.
Just before the king spoke, Catalan President Carles Puigdemont told the BBC his government would declare independence within days. That would intensify the crisis. The Spanish government might respond by revoking Catalonia's autonomy. At the same time, Catalonia has its eyes on Europe, turning to the European Union for mediation. European leaders have mostly backed the Spanish government, but they've issued veiled criticism of Madrid's heavy-handed approach. Owen Alterman, I-24 News.
In Israel, there is now a crackdown on creepy clowns after a spate of pranks in public parks. An odd new trend has emerged where youngsters in clown costumes are spooking people after dark.
Police describe the recent phenomenon as part of an international trend vowing to enforce strict and uncompromising consequences on any illegal impersonators. I-24 News reporter Ariel Levine-Waldman has more.
Grim specters are stalking the streets of Israel and striking panic into the hearts of children and adults. You might know them by their pallid faces looming out of the night, or maybe by the screams that follow. They are clowns, but this is no joking matter, and the Israeli government has gotten involved. It's an international trend that became quite popular in the United States. People dressing as creepy clowns to prank and scare people, given new life by the success of Stephen King's It, featuring the evil clown Pennywise. For the clowns themselves, it's just a way to relieve boredom. No harm done. But police say it's downright dangerous. Police are afraid a panicked citizen or security officer might shoot a clown, thinking themselves or children are under attack. They say it's also just a general threat to public order. The Ministry of Education has made a public statement to the parents and teachers of terrified children and issued a reminder that menacing anyone is illegal. Israel's real clowns, and they have a union, fear the imposters might cast their own profession into disrepute. A series of arrests have already been made and usually end in questioning and a fine. But should any Israeli consider donning a mask, the police have vowed to be entirely uncompromising. Ariel Levin-Waldman, I-24 News.
What do you make of this?
Well, I'm lucky to be in the U.S. now and not in Israel because first clowns are just, well, very scary, but it's not funny. In fact, I read that they were using pepper spray in some cases, and they even held knives on them when the police arrested them. So, but now we also learned that there's a union for clowns in Israel from this report, right?
Who knew? And meanwhile, I mean, we've had the problem with creepy clowns here in the United States, and given the proclivity of guns, a lot of people have thought, you know what, maybe you shouldn't be scaring people in this day and age like this. I don't know.
Right, yeah. There's enough security issues in Israel to be concerned about. Well, still to come here on Crossroads, a U.S. congressman accused of hypocrisy.
Wait until you hear what a lawmaker with a pro-life stance in public allegedly said to his pregnant mistress in private.
Welcome back. A U.S. Republican representative is reportedly lying to both his wife and the American people.
Tim Murphy is a strong and frequent critic of abortion, but when things changed in his personal life, so too did his stance. All right, 24 News New York Bureau Chief Steve Langford has the story.
Congressman Tim Murphy's Facebook page on January 27th of this year, hailing the annual March for Life, the anti-abortion rally in Washington. The Republican congressman earlier that week touting his sponsorship and vote for a House bill banning taxpayer funding for abortions. Murphy declaring, quote, "We will once again be a nation committed to honoring life from the moment of conception." But that same week, Congressman Murphy got a text message from Shannon Edwards, with whom he was having an affair. Edwards stating, quote, "And you have zero issue posting your pro-life stance all over the place when you had no issue asking me to abort our unborn child just last week." The response to that revelation published by the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, a text back from the congressman replying to Edwards, quote, "I get what you say about my March for Life messages. I've never written them. Staff does them. I read them and winced. I told staff, don't write anymore. I will. The 65-year-old congressman is married, as was his 36-year-old girlfriend, until their affair was exposed in her messy divorce case in Pennsylvania recently. No comment from the congressman or his now ex-girlfriend. In the end, it turns out Edwards was not, in fact, pregnant. In September, Congressman Murphy admitted to the Pittsburgh newspaper that he'd had the affair, adding, quote, "I will have nothing further to say on this matter." Nothing further except for the fact he's retiring. Congressman Murphy just announcing he will not seek re-election.
Let me guess, he wants to spend more time with his family.
Well, the specific quote in the statement is, "In the coming weeks, I will take personal time to seek help as my family and I continue to work through our personal difficulties and seek healing."
What's worse, the hypocrisy or the fact that his staff used to write all his posts for him with his opinions?
And he apparently didn't believe them.
Steve Langford, our New York Bureau Chief. Steve, that's hypocrisy, and it's wrong. Wait a second, wrong channel. Steve, thanks as always. Appreciate it.
All right, remember to stick around with us after the break for news updates from our I-24 News World headquarters in Tel Aviv.
We will have the latest on the investigation into the Las Vegas gunman as authorities are finally now questioning his girlfriend. Details on that and our other global headlines are coming up. I-24 News continues after this.